Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to those who have made it out on this cold night, and also welcome to those who are watching online, and to those who will be watching online. And it's been very encouraging. The first session that we did, there have been over 200 views, over 100 for the second, and the aim is to make this a resource that's useful for people. So that's the aim, and that's what we're trying to do. So welcome, and we're going to be talking about the church. Before I do that, just a little bit of mention of commentaries that I've written recently on all of the Gospels, and I'm also writing commentaries on the rest of the New Testament. I can make these available for lower than the normal price. Just happens that Matthew and Luke were the last to be done, and they are $25 each, and Mark and John were done earlier, and they're $20 each. But I've also mentioned there Dear Kim, and that's something that you can read online on my website. My website's there, billloader.com, very simple. And you'll find Dear Kim, This Is What I Believe, where I deal with issues that we've dealt with in this series. I wrote that some time ago, but about God, about Jesus, about the Bible, about the church, about the Christian life. So those are resources that I can make available and that are there for you to look up. So let's start talking about the church. This is the church where I was first minister in 1968 and 69. It's in Auckland in New Zealand on the North Shore. Church is, of course, a churchy word, but originally it wasn't a churchy word at all. The word ecclesia was really the word for any meeting or gathering, and only later did it become a word for a church building, but originally it was about a gathering, a meeting. And in a way, the synagogue, the term synagogue is like that. It actually means a coming together. So originally, it's also about people getting together, and only secondarily about being a building. But we're going to go beyond that to talk about the beginnings of our faith. Our Jesus movement, our church, our tradition goes back to hope movements that were there in Palestine, in Israel in the first century. The Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, they were one of the groups, and you can see the caves in which we found scrolls there. They were one of the groups who looked to the future, and they actually met separately. So they actually met separately as a sect, as a gathering, as well as living out in the wider community. But John the Baptist and Jesus, who talked about the future, we don't have any evidence that they initially set up separate gatherings. If anything, they were their church or their assembly was the people of Israel. And so that was their role. Later, of course, there were groups of Jesus followers. That's where the church came from. And there were groups of John the Baptist followers, and we know that they existed in the first century and later as well, and survived down through the centuries. So John the Baptist and Jesus shared the message, according to Matthew, and probably correctly, the kingdom of God has come near, like hope is at hand. You need to turn to God and believe the good news. The thing about Jesus was that he didn't just stay in the waiting room, as it were, like outside of the land, as John the Baptist did. He actually entered the land, and he actually said, yes, the kingdom of God is at hand, and it's already breaking in, and what I'm doing, and what I want you to do with me, is part of that breaking in the present. So he said, follow me to some. So he formed an itinerant group, and he said, follow me at home to most other people, stay where you are. That's the two different ways of responding, but the itinerant group was a small group that travelled around Galilee. As we mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, it was a protest movement in a way. It was stepping outside of the existing system which kept some people rich and kept some people poor, and it pulled people out of family structures and family pressures into a kind of independent living. They were partners. They were called to be partners with Jesus in what he was doing, and they had their own support system. And we know that we get reports, he summoned the 12 and started sending them out in pairs. They were sharing what he was doing. The mission, however, was only to Israel. It was a hope for change soon, but as I've said, it was change already happening now. And this is really quite interesting. One of the fascinating questions is, did Jesus baptize people? Like John the Baptist baptized. Jesus was a colleague of John the Baptist. The early church baptized. Is it really the case that Jesus did not baptize? Interestingly, John's Gospel, which is highly symbolic in many ways, but over the top of, or underneath that symbolic creative rendering that you've got in the Gospel, you've also got some old traditions. And one of those old traditions says that Jesus actually baptized more people than John the Baptist. And then a few verses later, this is in chapter 3, a few verses later, it says, well, actually, no, it wasn't Jesus, it was his disciples who did the baptizing. So at least it does seem, it's very likely that Jesus also baptized, that's to say, called people to immerse themselves, to let themselves to be immersed in God's goodness and forgiveness and love, and to be therefore ready for the new thing that's about to happen. Jesus appointed 12 apostles or 12 disciples. Why? Well, because there are 12 tribes. It was very Israel-focused. That's why he chose 12. And what's more, he said, now don't go off to places where Gentiles live. So don't go to the Gentiles and don't go to the Samaritans, but go rather only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So we need to understand this, that Jesus' ministry, Jesus' mission and those with him was really an Israel, a national focus, and that's where it stayed for quite some time. Did they have any thoughts about Gentiles, that's to say foreigners, non-Jews? Yes, of course they did. And one was avoid them, but the other was that, well, ultimately they will come too. The prophetic traditions talked about the nations will come and they'll beat their swords into ploughs and their spears into pruning hooks. There'll be a great feast on Mount Zion and the nations will come as well. And how they understood that is really not clear. The parable of the mustard seed is interesting. It may well point to this as well, because the mustard tree, as Jesus tells the parable, says, well then, and the birds of the air will come and nest in it or nest under it. Birds was an image used for the foreigners in the Old Testament, and so it's quite possible that that was there. But normally you would avoid the Gentiles, and there are a couple of occasions where Jesus encounters them. They are almost interrupting his ministry. So the centurion comes to Jesus and says, look, I'm not worthy for you to come under my house. I mean, Jesus kind of says, according to Matthew's version, am I to come and heal him? You don't really expect me to come to your place, do you? And of course the man says, no, of course I'm not, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word. And of course there was a healing, but Jesus healed the centurion's servant at a distance. The Syrophoenician story is really a daring story, and you wonder who's, been behind the creativity of it. But the Syrophoenician woman comes about her daughter, and according to Mark, Jesus says, look, I can't take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, which is a really racist statement expressing keep away from the Gentiles. Now, whether Jesus actually said that, how it was meant, Matthew thinks it was meant, because Matthew then adds that Jesus said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So it's really quite exclusive. And of course, the girl was healed at a distance. So Jesus' relationship with Gentiles was exceptional, and it was at a distance. But there are these two occasions, and of course when people told stories about Jesus later, once the church moved out into foreigner territory, out into the nations, they grasped these stories and highlighted them. And what they highlighted was that Jesus was in fact prepared to cross the boundaries sometimes, and of course that's what the church then eventually had to do. We do have a saying of Jesus, I tell you, many will come from east and west and will take their place at table with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. That'll happen somehow, but then history went on and it became a particular issue. Should they actually go and do it themselves, or was God going to bring the nations in? Now, when they had reached the end of a year, or John's Gospel says 3 years of Jesus' ministry with his team that had been travelling around, and they went up to Judea and they went up to Jerusalem and they had a last meal. Jesus was obviously aware that this was dangerous for him. He was facing death, and he takes bread and he says, well, look, this is me. I've been giving myself. This is what's happening. We know that Peter and James and John seem to have had a significant role in the group of disciples who were with Jesus. And we also know that women were in the group. Mark tells us about that. In fact, what happens is that the men, the disciples, flee when Jesus is arrested. They go for their lives. They, in fact, flee in the direction of Galilee back home. And the women actually remain. It's quite interesting. And so that's how it all comes to an end. And that's the end, the tragic end of the ministry of Jesus, which simply stopped there, and we didn't hear anything more about it, except that, of course, something did happen. It wasn't the end. It's very interesting that Peter, and the word Peter, Petros, in Greek means a rock. It's a translation of his Aramaic name, which is Cephas, which also means a rock. So he's the rock on which the church, if you like, the foundation of the church, because he said that he saw Jesus after his death. And there were other experiences as well, but his was fundamental. And that's connected to the fact that he is seen as the foundation. And so what that meant is that God has vindicated what Jesus was saying. Now, we talked more about that when we had the session on Jesus, but what it meant for the people was that they said, so it's true what he said, and it's time, it's going to happen, so Jesus is going to come as the Messiah soon. So we know that that was the expectation. The early church, the early movement in Jerusalem were kind of hanging out for, it's going to happen very soon. And what happened was that the itinerants, who usually travelled around and were put up by people, they settled in Jerusalem to wait because it was all about to happen. It wasn't such a good idea. Luke kind of idealizes and says, well, they sold up property and they shared possessions. They eventually end up being the poor, for whom there needs to be a collection, because they weren't really going to survive well as time went on. So what happened in the early days, that they not only proclaimed what Jesus had proclaimed, but they also proclaimed what had happened to Jesus. So there's the good news and there's the good news about Jesus, and that's what they were doing. And initially it was the expectation that, well, he's the first to be raised, resurrection's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. There were, in Jerusalem, in the communities of hope who were associated with Jesus, there were Aramaic speakers, of course, the locals, but there were also Greek-speaking Jews. There were Greek-speaking synagogues, actually, in Jerusalem as well. So in a way, you had two different language groups. I mean, some of them would be bilingual, but otherwise they might not be. So you have groups now forming of people who believed what Jesus preached and now believed what Peter and James and John preached. So you get the beginnings of the church movement, really, as they gather together. Gather together in a sense rejoicing and with hope, gather together in a sense also defensively. So there were conversions. People said, yes, I'll take on board what they're saying about Jesus. There were baptisms, and probably because that was just continued what was happening during Jesus' ministry. And it says they were sharing together and they were breaking bread, kind of doing what Jesus did the night before he died. They continued to do that. That, of course, was a lot to do with saying we're having this sharing of food now. It's a foretaste. It's our acting out a foretaste of the great feast that's to come in the future. They also talked not only about Jesus coming, but as time went on, they also said, well, actually the Spirit of God has come amongst us. But they also said, and the Spirit of Jesus is with us. It really becomes, conceptually somewhat untidy, because sometimes they would say, well, Jesus is with us, or the Spirit of God is with us, or the Spirit of Jesus is with us. And still you'll find that today, that people will sometimes say, oh, well, we're praying to Jesus. Actually, we're praying to God. Who are we praying to, really? It's kind of all a bit mixed up. But that was the experience they had, and it was significant. So they devoted themselves to listening to the teaching of the apostles and to being in community, breaking bread and together and praying. But in the Greek-speaking communities, and this is really interesting, the Greek-speaking communities of Jews who followed Jesus and the Greek-speaking communities of Jews who didn't, there was a clash between them. It's not all that surprising that people who lived out in the rest of the empire, and there were more Jews living out there than there were living in Judea and Galilee. Often exile groups or diaspora groups, we find that today, often they will be more conservative than the lands from which they come. And that was probably the case there too. So there was great sensitivity about anything that they thought they heard that Jesus, or that the Christians were saying about Jesus, which called the law and the temple into question. Stephen, of course, was the one who was first killed because of this by the Greek speakers. Paul actually was there, Paul. The comment was, this fellow is forever maligning this holy place and the law. And so what happened was that the Greek-speaking people, leaders in particular, left. They left Jerusalem. It was really too dangerous for them. The Aramaic speakers, like Peter and James and John, they remained there, and so did the Aramaic speaking communities of followers of Jesus. But the Greek-speaking ones, they moved. So they went to places like Damascus and Antioch and places like that. And when they went there, they went to the synagogues, of course, and they talked to other Jews. They spread within Judaism, within the Jewish diaspora, they spread the news about Jesus' resurrection, and about the message that indeed change is going to come, and it's going to come soon. Now I'm going to stop at this point and have a pause so that there's opportunity for any questions from the small group that we have here, and there is a microphone sitting over there on the front. If anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, you'll need to pick up the microphone to do it.
I don't know if this is a question, but I guess I was a little bit caught up on the idea of Jesus being focused on on the sheep of Israel.
Yeah.
And I guess I've often read the Bible and I think, or the Gospels, and think, Jesus very much is multicultural, intercultural. Like, even when he talks about Israel, is he actually referring to all believers? And I don't actually know what the question is, but even between the Gospels, do we see a bit of a difference between the way that he talks about Gentiles compared to Jews?
It's interesting that it's fairly consistent that the Gospels portray Jesus as having his ministry to Israel. Now, in Matthew, it's very clear, it's underlined. Matthew has Jesus tell people, don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And Matthew adds into the Syrophoenician woman's story, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In Matthew, it's not until the very last verses that Jesus says, now go to all the nations and teach them what I've been teaching you. In John's Gospel, it's interesting that you have very little interaction with Gentiles in his story, except right near the end in chapter 12, there are some Greeks who want to see Jesus. The author then says, well, kind of uses symbolism and says, well, when the seed dies, it's going to bear much fruit. And it's kind of so the mission to the Gentiles is going to come later. And Mark, of course, and Luke as well, you see. As we'll see, Luke takes 10 or 15 chapters, at least 10 chapters in Acts before he tells the story that really it was okay to go to Gentiles. It's quite interesting that that's consistently there. Yeah. Other comments or questions?
Is there a link between the scripture about not building on the sand and building on the rock, and Peter being the rock?
That particular imagery, to build on a rock and not on sand, really belongs in a different context. It's behind Matthew and it's behind Luke, so it's in the Q source. It's really talking... No, I don't think there is a link with Peter there, but in other places you do have a play with Peter's name. On this rock I will build my church. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what came first, the nickname or the story? And you're absolutely pulling at straws. But I just heard that, and
Yeah.
instinctually thinking of other scripture about the miry clay and putting your feet upon the rock, and now in Psalms, and there's a lot of rock and being a foundation, and then Peter being the rock and the foundation of the church, and I was just wondering if you...
Yeah, it's particularly, the rock is all the teachings that have come in the Sermon on the Mount. Walk with those and you'll be stable. Otherwise you won't be. Luke is similar in Luke 6. The personnel thing with Peter, Matthew uses that in Matthew 18, actually Matthew 16, where he says, you are Peter and on this rock I will build my church. He adds that into Mark's material. Maybe that's read back, but certainly Peter being the first witness to the resurrection makes him the starting point. Of course, you will remember, maybe you won't, but there are all sorts of debates about, does this mean that this is the beginning of the papacy? No, it's not the beginning of the papacy. There'll be Protestants I can remember in my youth who would say, oh no, the rock can't be Peter, it has to be the message of Jesus. And there would be people on the Catholic side saying, oh well, this is the foundation of the papacy. It was neither of those things.
Yeah, I was thinking he'll taste like honey in the rock. There's so much rock in there, and so I just think it's interesting then giving Peter that term. Even God, I am your rock, and all this sort of scripture that I might have taught to kids over time. And then you have Jesus, the juxtaposition, saying where two or more are gathered, there is the church, which is a very different feeling metaphor to rock. And I was just wondering what the importance of giving Peter the name rock might be in association with church.
I mean, that's really interesting historically, because John's Gospel mentions that Jesus gave Peter the name Peter. Now, that's possible during the ministry. That alternatively, Peter got the name somehow related to the resurrection and the resurrection appearances. In a way, it doesn't matter. But the image of rock is really quite strong. You get it in 1 Peter, which is not written by Peter, but written in his name. And there, the assembly of believers are to come together and, like rocks, be built into a spiritual temple. And then you can play with that, So, okay, I'm built into this temple. I'm fragile. I'm, pretty worn. I'm pretty old. You're freshly cut. We're all rocks together to create a place in which people experience the presence of God. It's kind of quite an inspiring kind of thought.
And Christ the cornerstone. It just goes on, you know.
Well, you see, Christ the cornerstone, that's another image, yes. The stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner, or the cornerstone, was a way of using Psalm 118 to interpret the importance of Jesus' resurrection. Okay, are we ready to go on to the next part? Okay. So one of the challenges, and we've talked about this last time about the Bible, is, well, first of all, do you go to the Gentiles, or do you leave that to God? Because the belief was that God would do this. And that may have been Jesus' belief. We don't really know. But they clearly, in the historical material, there's no indication that Jesus was saying, I want you to do it. I mean, we've got the story in Matthew, but I'll come back to that. In Acts, we've got the story that it took some process, some time, before the church realised that actually it was okay to go to Gentiles. Now, what Luke does over 10 chapters, Matthew concertinas into Matthew 28, 18 to 20. I mean, that happens. So in effect, Matthew kind of says, oh, well, Jesus really wanted us to go to all the nations, and that's fine. So that's how that happened. But the issues, of course, that arose were particularly initially with the Gentiles who were sympathetic to Jews, especially the idea of one God. That was attractive to many non-Jews, and so they would come to the synagogue. They weren't converted. They'd have to be circumcised if they were converted. So they would sort of sit at the back, but they would be there. And you can just imagine that the issue was, now we've got not just one or two joining us. Like in Genesis 17, you've got to circumcise Gentiles whom you've brought into your household as slaves, or who are working in your area. You must circumcise them. What do you do when you've got a whole lot of people wanting to join who are foreigners? And what they decided was, against the view of the fundamentalists who looked to Genesis 17, they decided we won't impose circumcision. And you can kind of almost think, what a great relief that would have been. You'd almost like they got out of their seats and ran down and said, we'll join you now. We're happy to be converted. We don't have to be cut. There was things like, so what do you do? It's really complicated. We know how to live as Jews, among Jews, but when we're in a foreign Gentile world, they eat differently, they don't prepare their food properly. Do we eat with them? And last time I talked about the fact that there were complications there and there were debates there. And some people said, no, you must not. And others said, yes, we will. And Paul talks about that. It's interesting that Paul makes a collection from the various churches in response to need, but that collection also in some ways symbolises the foreigners coming to Jerusalem, like their money coming. That had something to do with the way he talked about it. Now, Matthew simply says, has Jesus say, go and make disciples, make learners. When we use the word disciples, we often lose that. Make learners, get them to be learners of what I've been teaching you, of all nations, and teach them what I've been teaching you. Well, what happened was that they went out into synagogues, and then, of course, they'd have conflict with the synagogue leaders, so they would then need to gather separately. So some of them would go to the synagogue in the morning, and then on the Saturday evening, the Sabbath evening, which is really the Sunday, starts at 6 o'clock, they would have their Christian meeting, if you like. They wouldn't call themselves Christian at this point, but they had this Jesus movement. They had the beginnings of the church, their ecclesia, and they would gather there. And so what happened is that as the movement spread out into the empire, all of these little groups meeting in house churches formed. And that's a very different situation from a group of people who are itinerants going around Galilee telling people, stay where you are, but believe in Jesus, follow him, or come and follow with us. Those were now house churches. And who's got a house big enough for us to meet in? Well, somebody with a bit of money. So in terms of economy, we're now looking at meetings in houses big enough to actually accommodate a group. Now that's really quite interesting. We also find that they baptized households. Now, if we only had the stats, if they wrote down everything, we'd know that there'd be children amongst them. There might even be babies. Like, they thought less in terms of individuals and more in terms of groups and households. So the household was converted and everybody was baptized and they all joined. One of the interesting things was that the person who, in a marriage in the ancient world, and this is true in Judaism as well as in the wider Roman Empire, the man, of course, he's the spokesperson for dealing with the wider world. But who manages the household? The woman. And that's really quite interesting. So you'd be having people gathering in households with a woman manager. And that could lead to all kinds of problems and complications. But it was interesting. And what's more, in a household, if you're in a house that's big enough to have a gathering, you've probably got slaves as well. In your gathering, you're going to have not only women, but you're going to have slaves. And you're going to have children. So that was really interesting. They belong too. That raised all kinds of questions. There was also the question of, when we meet in your house, is that a private event? Are we gathering together as your friends, like a visitor? We're visiting you in your household? I mean, if it's a private event, then we can take our veils off, and the women, and we treat it differently. But if it's a public event, then of course we mustn't do that. And so there were issues about, very minimal, for us insignificant issues, but, Paul has to write about it. Look, this is actually a public event. So even when they're speaking, there's some women will speak, they're not to uncover their heads. They've got to keep dressed the way they're normally dressed in everyday life, like we see Muslim women today. And there were other pressures, of course. If you're meeting in my house, and I've got a big house and slaves and things, and I'm a respectable person, I'm respected in the wider community, Then I'm under pressure also to be seen as respectable. So how much is that going to clash with this new radical love that's coming in? Am I still the head of the house? Should my wife be obeying me and the children slaves? How does all that work out? And what eventually happened, of course, is that side won. You know? So eventually, no, we're not going to have women priests, ministers. The man is the head of the house, the spokesperson, the preacher, and wives obey husbands. But there was this undermining notion: there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, not male and female. You're all one in Christ Jesus. You're all valued. So that was really, really significant, that you now have not a synagogue where all the adults are there, but you've got a household and you've got kids there. Kids belong. That was really quite important and quite challenging. They gathered for what they called love feasts, which outsiders would think, what sort of erotic thing was going on there? But they had love feasts, and the normal thing, and we see this from what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11, was that the bread would be broken, like Jesus did the night before he was killed. And it's like you say, grace, you break the bread and you give thanks. That happens, and then you have the meal. And then after the meal, you have a cup of wine. Now that was the normal thing, and that's how Paul was told, and how he says this is how it goes. We often forget this. It all began not as a separate little thing happening, but it was part of a meal, part of a fellowship meal where you came together. And then what happened by the time even Paul was writing to the Corinthians, their pattern then developed that they had the meal first, and then they had the bread and the cup. You realise what can happen there. Well, we arrived early and we were eating the food that's there, and you arrived, oh, sorry, there's not very much left. And Paul has to say, look, for goodness sake, wait for each other. You know, it wasn't just the poor, it would have been businessmen as well who were busy. You're not waiting for them. And Paul has to say, look, when you do that, you're really not celebrating the Lord's Supper, because you're not understanding what it's on about. And of course, the eventual, how this evolved was that we have the bread and the cup as a separate event, as a separate Eucharist or Mass or Holy Communion. That has all kinds of implications, because it actually tends to put the focus on the food, whereas when it was the beginning and the end of a meal, the focus wasn't on the food, it was on the action. And so thus begin the debates about, you know, does the bread become magically the body of Christ? You know, what is the substance? All of those kind of debates come out of the separation of the bread and the cup from the meal. Originally, of course, it was a foretaste. Other groups did this too. They had wine and they had bread and they met together and they said, we're having this celebration now. Pharisees did it as well. Essenes did it. We're having, the Christians were not unique in doing this. We're doing this because the day's going to come when we will be doing it in the kingdom of heaven or in the kingdom of God. And they won't be there because we're exclusive. We're Essenes or we're Pharisees. And of course, what Jesus did was to say there's an invitation to all to be there. And when we do this, when we have this meal, this is our celebrating now what we're going to be looking forward to in the future. It was also a time of sensing belonging and fellowship and a sense of the presence of Jesus. So you have this wonderfully untidy notion that Jesus is coming and yet Jesus is here. Like, spirituality doesn't have to be logical. There's something profound about this. And of course, remembering whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes, remembering. Now, there were practicalities. How on earth could you keep control of all these little house groups across the empire as far away as Rome? How could you keep control? How could you keep them in contact with what the Jesus movement was on about? It was really difficult. And one of the things that happened was that the itinerants who were travelling around and being sent out to do things in Galilee now become envoys who go travel to Ephesus or travel to Corinth. And there were new ones who joined them, like Paul. He's also an envoy, an apostle. He travels around. So what these key visiting preachers or apostles did was to keep the connection, to keep people on track. It was very easy not to be on track. And what we also know happened is that some people turned up in Corinth and you're going to put me up, aren't you? You know, you've got a bed and breakfast for me and you're going to supply me meals. And it turns out I'm a crook. I'm really exploiting the situation. And so what we find by the end of the first century, but it was already happening in Paul's time, was that some of these visiting preachers were actually ripping people off. So that was a difficult problem. They had to address that. What they did was to pass on the stories of Jesus, not in great screeds, but largely as anecdotes, short stories with a punchline. You know, controversy about what are you doing on the Sabbath? The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Eating with tax gatherers and sinners. I didn't come to call sinners, I came to call the righteous. No, I didn't come to call the righteous, I came to, you know, little anecdotes like that you find in the Gospels that were then collected together in the Gospels. The Gospels, coming some decades later, were also part of the reason for the Gospels was trying to keep connection and keep the church on track. All these little groups could go, it could be absolute chaos, but it wasn't chaos. Well, it was to some degree. And then later, of course, what they did was to say, well, we're going to identify which of these writings that have been circulating give a reliable presentation of what the church is about, what the gospel's about. They are the rule. Canon is a word, it just simply means a ruler. So they are the measure of what's genuine, and we're not going to have some of these other ones that were kicking around because people began to write gospels about all kinds of things. You know, a gospel of Mary Magdalene, not genuine at all, but where Mary has pillow talk conversations with Jesus, who tells her that really he came to rescue people from their physical bodies and their sexuality. It's all about escaping this world. So go and make disciples, learners of all nations, teaching them to observe everything I've told you. And for Matthew, that means teaching them everything I've got in my gospel. Keep them on track. They also needed leadership for the same reason, because things could get out of hand, and sometimes they did. So they had overseers, and the word for overseer in Greek is episkopos. It becomes the word bishop. It's a little bit like the word church, which wasn't religious at all. Episkopos wasn't a religious term at all. It was really a supervisor, an overseer, but it became the word that then gets translated as bishop. But that's kind of down the track. Elders would normally be senior people in a synagogue. The Greek word for an elder is presbyteroi, and that sounds like Presbyterian, and it is connected to that. And this is where you kind of eventually get these called presbyters or priests or ministers. And diakonoi was a general term for servants or slaves. The Latin word for diakonoi, translating it, is minister. You know, originally it's about a slave, a servant, and you can see how down through the ages, all three terms, bishops, priests and deacons, turned into very religious terms that had very special hierarchical meaning, but they didn't have that meaning originally. They needed to deal with issues of discipline and abuse. Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians. He had to confront them. He sent them we don't have the copy of it, but he said, I sent a letter. I was really regretful about doing it, but it needed to happen. Somebody in Corinth had abused him. Things had gone wrong. And a lot of what he writes in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is all about, you Corinthians, you really got to sort yourself out. You know, you can't let him get away you can't have leaders who are corrupt. Now, corruption set in at a very early stage. Matthew picks up what would be the norm of the day for dealing with conflict management. And he says, well, Matthew 18, he has Jesus say, well, you know, somebody's going off the track. One of you go and have a chat. If he doesn't listen, a couple of you go along. And if he still doesn't listen, bring it to the church, the assembly, and make a decision. And Matthew, interestingly, says, and if he won't change, treat him like a Gentile, which is kind of funny, isn't it? In other words, have nothing to do with him. Interesting kind of thoughts. And it's interesting, it's in that chapter that we have this famous statement, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I will be there among them. That's not about worship. It's about making decisions about church discipline. Where you have to do that, I'll be with you. And it won't be easy. And sometimes you'll get it wrong because the church is not infallible. They had to rejig the faith as they went out. You know, we started with Jewish national hope. That, you know, Jesus would return as the Jewish Messiah, and it'd be based in Jerusalem, and maybe the Gentiles would come and join, but anyway, it would be changed. There would be good news for the poor, the hungry. Blessed are you. It's going to change for you. But now you've gone out into the wider world. It doesn't make sense to talk about the future as... I'm not interested as a person living in Rome or living in Corinth about having Jesus coming to Jerusalem and having all Jews. That's not relevant for me. So they had to change and they had to adjust. And so from Jesus being the Messiah to come, the focus moved to, well, let's think about Jesus as not going to rule the 12 tribes with the disciples, but Jesus as kind of like ruling for God one day in the world and starting to rule now. What they also did, because, you know, if Jewish hope was focused on the nation of Israel and it's based on Jerusalem, how could you translate that into the wider world? Well, what they tended to do is to say, well, really, no, we can't think about a special renewed Rome or a special renewed Corinth. The key thing is that there will be an afterlife. And what they then did, because the issue of what's after this life was really important, Paul says, well, people sleep. They go into a semi-kind of conscious sleep. And when Jesus comes, they'll be brought back to consciousness and be alive. What actually happened fairly early on was that people said, oh, actually, I'll go to be with Jesus and I'll have some consciousness. Already John's Gospel has got that idea, and Luke's Gospel has. Luke has Jesus say to the man on the cross who's sympathetic towards him, he says, look, today you will be with me in paradise. Not sleeping, you'll be there. So what they did was to focus on the afterlife. And if you think about it, that's become the standard way of thinking about it in the church today. You know, I go to heaven when I die, or I go to hell when I die. Like after, when I die, that's when the things are decided, what I'm going to do, where I'm going to be. That is very different. So in the Creed it said, and the resurrection of the dead and the life everlasting, a judgment day Well, what they did was they kept the idea of Jesus coming again and a general resurrection and a judgment, but it was kind of now postponed, especially as Jesus didn't turn up. You know, the decades went by and he didn't turn up. Paul thought he would during his lifetime, but he didn't. So now those beliefs, they're still there, but in fact they become less relevant. Like they're not terribly relevant for people today in their spirituality, and they weren't as the church moved out into the wider Roman world. Well, yes, okay, Jesus will come, there will be, but really, when I die, I'll go to be with him. So it changed the focus of hope. One of the things that did was it tended to help people or make people think about me and my individual future. When I die, I'll go to be with God. I'll go to be with Jesus. Now, that's fine, but it kind of, the focus on the individual led to a kind of individualism. And what was then lost, of course, if you think about it, was this whole notion of social change, good news for the poor. Like that really loses its place when everything is focused on the individual and the individual's salvation. One of the other things that happened was, and they stamped this out, but one of the things that happened was that people began to say, yes, and you know, for some, life was hell. Like, life was really tough. We're comfortable, so it doesn't matter for us. But life, I want to be liberated from this body with its cancer and its pain and my disabilities. I want to be liberated. This is an evil body I have. It must have been created, the physical, material world, it's a conspiracy. It must have been a demented God who created this world. And the real God, who's come with Jesus, is going to rescue us from this awful creation that we're stuck in and we're suffering. Now, that was a logic that you could see would lead in certain directions. The church said, no, creation is good. Even when there's suffering, God is the creator. It wasn't a dirty trick by a second God. But you can see how the focus on the individual could lead to that kind of distraction. In rejigging the faith, I think I've got, that's all right. In rejigging the faith, they had to deal with the issue of Jesus' delay. He didn't turn up, and he still hasn't turned up. So, you know, you have to adjust to that. You have to rethink it. It was very important for the early days. They expected the resurrection had started. Jesus was the first. They expected Jesus to return during their lifetime. Even some of the gospel writers portray Jesus as saying that. But the delay, the whole movement could have collapsed if it was all focused on the future and Jesus' return. It didn't collapse. Why didn't it collapse? Because the focus was somewhere else. For a start, the dead are not sleeping, like Paul says, hanging around sleeping until Jesus comes. They're alive. They're alive in the world of heaven or in the world of hell. And we have now the Spirit of God or the Spirit of Christ. We have this life now. So the relationship with God through Christ became the more important thing than focusing on the event to come. And what you actually find is that there's a tendency to move away from focusing on big events, like the death of Jesus as a sacrifice for sin or the coming of Jesus in the future sometime. The focus moved from events to encounter. In John's Gospel, this is particularly true because Jesus comes saying, I'm the bread of life. I give you the water of life. Actually, he wasn't saying I am. He was saying I am, but really he was meaning God is. I'm channeling God. I'm a conduit for God. That's really the all-important thing, is your relationship with God. That's a redefining of the spirituality. It's actually a rejigging of the faith that was focused on the big event to come, to be now focused not on the event but on the person. Oneness with God, who is the water, the bread and the word. And so what John's Gospel does in particular is picks up a strand that you find in some parts of the New Testament and makes it central. He is the Word. He is God's Word, God's wisdom. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A crazy statement. Because how can you be with somebody and be somebody? Well, of course you could if you were thinking as Jews did about God's wisdom. They sometimes spoke of it as God's wisdom is like God's companion, always there. But they actually meant, oh, of course God isn't without wisdom. Don't be silly. That is God. But there was just different, nicely untidy ways of talking about the reality of God. What then happened was a tendency to merge Jesus with God. And I talked about this a bit before. Some people are talking about Jesus and they're really talking about God, and you know, Jesus is with us, or another group will say God is with us, or the Spirit is with us. It's very untidy and it doesn't really matter. But what it did was to say, well, in effect, the significance of Jesus was that he was a channel for God. He was God in the flesh. Oh, hang on. There were some problems with that. If he was channeling God, was his brain, did he have a human brain as well as the Spirit of God? How did they connect? Was he schizophrenic? Did he only appear to be human? Was he a disguise? And already at the time when John's Gospel was written, we see that this was a problem. And I've got a text there that I'll read to you. One of the soldiers stabbed Jesus in his side with a spear, and immediately came out blood and water. Now, listen to the next bit. And the one who saw this has testified that it was so. And his testimony is reliable, and he knows he's telling the truth, so that you can really believe it. Now, this is falling over backwards to say, the guy can be trusted. Jesus had a real human body. Blood and water came out when he was stabbed, just like it would with you. Because there were people in John's Gospel's time saying, Jesus was a man, you know, he was God in disguise. He wasn't real. And what the church said, we know he was real. He was truly human. Another view was to say, well, how could he be God, and was he like an angel, or was he a second God? Was he like God? And what the church did in the creeds was to say, no, he was not a second God. No, he was not like God. The significant thing about Jesus is that it's God who is channeled in Jesus. And, yes, he was a real human being. And how do you get that to fit together logically? You don't. It's a paradox. But what the church has given us in the creeds is to say, we are not going to compromise about his humanity. We're not going to compromise about his divinity, or at least that he's a channel of the real God. He's not a second God or a semi-God. Mission, of course, became important. Numbers were not the most important thing. This is always a problem. It was called, people were being called to be partners with God. That's what the itinerants were about, and that's what the message was, that you're called to be partners with God. They were a suspect minority, most of them in the Roman Empire, and in the Roman Empire there was a prejudice against these odd people who come from the East. It was a kind of Roman Roman racism, odd religions, peculiar movements come from the East. These people meeting in this house, they're amongst those. You know, they have love feasts, my goodness. They eat somebody. I mean, really, they're outrageous. And one of the pressures was, goodness, we've got to show ourselves. We're not anti-Roman, for goodness sake. You know, oh yes, but your leader, your founder was a crim. You're not denying the fact that he was crucified as a criminal. Well, then they began to retell the story of Jesus' death, and we get this already in the gospel accounts, in such a way that the blame shifts from the Romans. In fact, Pilate was guilty for killing Jesus. He was just a bad Roman. If he'd done his job properly, he wouldn't have had Jesus killed. Who killed Jesus? It was the Jewish authorities. Now, unfortunately, that generalized into things that we sometimes hear today. The Jews killed Jesus. Like anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is alive and well and has been down through the centuries. And Christianity contributed to it, partly by coming to terms with trying to be acceptable to the Romans and somehow saying, well, you know, a good Roman wouldn't have killed Jesus. This focus on ourselves as a minority, and it's not for us, but for them it was, meant that caring, the social issues of reaching out and caring for people that you see in Jesus' ministry, it becomes in the Gospels already not caring for the people out there, but caring for one's own. I'm always disappointed when I read the judgment scene parable in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 25, where Jesus separates the sheep from the goats. And what he says is that, you know, when you did this, it's like you did it for me. Inasmuch as you did it to one of the, you helped out, you cared, you showed compassion for one of the least of these, my believers, you did it to me. Like, I take that parable and want to say, yeah, take you true, any human person who's loved. But Matthew and other, they were a minority, they were threatened, they couldn't go out and do major change in the streets of Corinth. They were a little huddled group. And so what they did was to care for themselves and showed caring, and they were challenged to do that. The model that they'd grown up with, of course, from Judaism was a cult model with a temple, and it had its patterns of worship. And of course, when they moved out into the wider world, yes, there were temples, but the model that became dominant was Jesus is like the best ruler, but even better. Now, the best ruler is a man, usually, and he's in control. Now, he's a mighty man, and you can see how things can go terribly wrong. So God is a mighty man, really stuck up and really annoyed that you've sinned and not prepared to forgive you at all unless somebody takes the punishment and his honour is restored. I mean, that's a tragedy, but sometimes they talked about God like that. And Jesus came to save me from God, which we know is an absolute nonsense. But de facto, that's what they sometimes are saying. Instead of saying, I've been saved by God, because actually God is compassionate. God is not like the rulers of this world. God does not delight in having everybody kowtow. God is not wanting to be, you know, the big egotist with everybody saying how great I am. That's to make God in our own image, our worst image. And so one of the things that we've inherited, of course, in our language of worship, we've inherited court language, court procedures, praying, bowing, all of those things. And one of the things we need to be on the guard against constantly is that we do not portray God as like a ruler king like that. If we're going to talk about God as a king, or Jesus as a king, let's have a crown of thorns. I mean, let's see that God is compassionate and loving. And so I find it quite frustrating when we have children's songs which talk about Jesus as the king, and and I think, oh no, this is not in touch with what the gospel's about. So, wrapping this up, the challenge was, and I think the church, for all its foibles, but I'm talking about the first century, at least held on to openness to God as loving. 1 John puts it in a nutshell and says, well, God is love. Understand that? God is love. Sharing the vision and agenda of Jesus is so important. And the agenda and the vision of Jesus, okay, his world is flat. He understood people's needs in terms of demonology. He was expecting with others that it would all happen within 10, 15 years, 20 years. Okay, we drop all of that, but we embrace the heart of what he was saying. Namely, we want to be good news for the poor. We want to be part of bringing hope, not just as a vision and a hope. Yes, we want to be part of inclusiveness that's there in the image of the feast, but we want to be people who put that into practice in our lives, as Jesus did in his life and his ministry. So partnership with new insights, leaving some things behind, having new understandings of challenges. They didn't have a clue about the issues of climate change or creation. Okay, that's fine. We learn new things. They didn't have much of a clue about structural injustices. They talked more in terms of individual injustices. We understand that's all right. We just use the knowledge that we have to be part of the vision, part of the agenda of Jesus. And as he said, according to John's Gospel, peace be with you. As my Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. And that's kind of the challenge for us as well. So we've got a bit of time for questions and discussion or any comments that you want to make.
I was thinking about how the strategy in picking the disciples Jesus did pick, that they're all, one's a zealot and there's brothers, and there's just so much division there across the diversity of who they are, that it's right for this group that's got to make sense of each other. And Jesus very deliberately has chosen that group, and then probably knowing that, well, if you've got to go and spread the news, you're going to run into all sorts of quabbles and things that are messy, and how do we wrestle this and that? But from the beginning with the 12, he walked with them for a few years and gave them some good practice and would have seen them. They don't get along that. They're not an easy group. They're very diverse. And I just think about if that was, you don't know, but by design, and certainly like Luke, for example, being the Gentile, and the stories he tells about the person on the cross, and the several other people he'll include in his gospel that others don't, which is really about broadening that conversation and making it more complex. What are your thoughts about the 12 disciples being a contentious group, and the importance of that as Paul tries to create the church with them?
I think one of the things that's happening in the passion narratives, the stories of Jesus' last days, is that the story is being told by the authors with an eye to what had been going on and was going on in their own communities. So to talk about a betrayer would have been highly relevant, because there were people who betrayed the local house churches to the Romans. Yeah? And to talk about the Peter's denial and do it so neatly as Mark loves threes. You know, 3 times he denies. John picks that up, the author of John's Gospel, and has 3 times he denies, and then has Jesus, the risen Jesus, come and 3 times say, Peter, are you with me? Do you love me? Do you love me? So feed my sheep, like the call of Peter, which is a message of compassion, of saying that, okay, these were fallible guys. Most of them ran away after all, but they were picked up again. And I think that's part of, part of it is saying, yeah, we have these experiences too. We have our betrayers. Maybe sometimes there's a bit of hate even in there in the story. Vengeance, glad he got killed, glad his bowels put... I mean, that becomes awful. But in the story of Peter, it's actually a model of you can make it. You can. And later, when the church was under pressure from the Romans, a couple of centuries later, there were groups who said, look, anyone who has told the Romans about us or given up their faith under Roman pressure, we're not going to have them back. The church in its wisdom said, yes, we are. We believe in repentance, we believe in renewal, we believe in forgiveness. And the story of Peter is really important for that.
So after that,
I suppose the question I'll take away, which I don't think we have to answer tonight, is like how do we discern, I suppose, between this, and I think the early church is often romanticised, like it was so wonderful, if only we could be like them, and I'd never heard that idea of like the reason why they were selling all their possessions and sharing with each other was because they thought they didn't have much time left anyway, might as well do it, so I appreciate that. But how do we discern what we can take from what they were doing, what's contextual to them, cultural to them, and how do we make what we're doing here now more like what we think God would have wanted for the church?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge, and I think we can do that if we take them seriously. We are engaged in a cross-cultural encounter when we're reading these texts. And that means we need to take into account the values that they had. We need to stop pretending that they're a model for us. Because they are and they're not. You know, we don't believe the world is flat. They believe the world is flat. They believe Jesus was coming in their lifetime. He didn't. So there are a whole lot of things that are not our world. We don't understand illness and mental illness in terms of demons anymore in most cultures. And you could say, well, do all those things there where we're distanced from them stack up to be enough for us to give it up, to give it all up? What we then find is that, hang on, there are values that are being expressed even in a different language, in a different culture, even with some different values like demonology. There are values being expressed there about a relationship with God and about what matters, which we hold dearly. So Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13 about love is actually that love is the sign of the Spirit. Gee, we understand that. You know, that's eternal, that's okay, he had his own peculiar way of expressing it. But when you look at Paul's writings, you'll often find that he's dealing with these struggles, especially, I mean, I've just been recently writing commentary on the Corinthian letters. Gosh, there are lots of problems. And every time he comes around and really says, well, what's the most loving thing to do here? So, you know, So I think that's important. I think the other important thing is to do what the creeds were in danger of not doing, and that is ignoring the ministry of Jesus. You know, if you say the creeds, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, what about the bit in between? Doesn't it matter what Jesus preached? And I think, no, we don't have to be nervous and say, oh, we can't reconstruct history. We've got a pretty good idea of what the vision was. So I think what we're doing in the church, at best, is reconnecting with what the focus of Jesus was. And I think people like Paul got it. And he would say people like Peter didn't. You know, people like the author of the fourth gospel, in a different way, really creatively rejigged the whole thing, but at least put love and relationship back in the centre. So that was good. So they did their thing creatively in their culture, and faithfulness really for us means seeking to do that in our culture. Yeah. Well, I think we can call this an evening, and we wish everyone well who's going to be watching. We've had lots of people watching the videos on YouTube. Over 200 people have watched the first one. So this is a resource, and we just hope that whoever's watching, that you'll find this helpful and that it'll inspire your faith and your commitment to what it means to be church, because you and I are church. Thank you.
You mentioned that they were worried about Jesus coming back in their lifetime. And when I was a kid, I read all the Left Behind books that were published. I think Tim LaHaye and Jenkins read the series.